Summer, 1989. The Hanover Place. Apartments in southeast Washington, D.C. A building superintendent found what was left of 23-year-old Cornell Jones in apartment 304. The local drug dealer had been tortured for hours before someone put a bullet in his head. His fingers were broken one by one. Burn marks covered his torso. The message carved into his chest was simple: D.C. closed. This was not how drug business worked in Washington. D.C. dealers shot rivals, sure, quick, professional, business. But torture, dismemberment, public displays of bodies left where families would find them? This was something else. This was Caribbean-style violence imported 1,500 miles from South Florida, and it was about to transform the nation's capital into a war zone. Between 1988 and 1991, young men from Miami, Fort Lauderdale, and West Palm Beach invaded Washington, D.C.'s crack cocaine market with a level of brutality that shocked federal agents who had seen everything. They didn't negotiate with local dealers. They didn't form partnerships. They simply took over, one apartment building at a time, leaving a body count that would make D.C. the murder capital of America. This is the true story of the Miami Boys, the out-of-town dealers who conquered D.C. through pure terror, the local dealers who tried to resist and died, the communities caught in the crossfire, and the 3-year murder spree that fundamentally changed how drugs move through America's capital city. But to understand how Miami took D.C., you need to know what D.C. was before they arrived. Washington, D.C. in 1987 was a crack cocaine market, but it was local. Dealers from Shaw, Congress Heights, Trinidad, and Simple City controlled their own neighborhoods. The violence was contained. Disputes got settled. Everyone knew everyone. Rayful Edmond III ran his operation in Northeast. Younger crews worked Southeast. The system, as brutal as it was, had rules. Then the Miami Boys discovered something the locals had overlooked. D.C. had no major Colombian or Dominican supplier connections. Local dealers were getting cocaine through middlemen, paying premium prices, accepting lower quality product. The profit margins were there, but nobody had the connections to maximize them. Nobody in D.C. anyway. Antonio "Tony" Lewis was 24 when he made his first trip from Fort Lauderdale to Washington in late 1987. According to DEA testimony in United States v. Lewis, DDC 1991, Tony had grown up in Liberty City, Miami's roughest neighborhood. His mother worked 2 jobs. His father was doing 20 years in Rayford Prison for armed robbery. By 16, Tony was running cocaine for Cuban dealers in Miami, learning the business from people who had been moving weight since the cocaine cowboys era. He was smart, disciplined, and completely ruthless when business required it. What Tony brought to D.C. wasn't just cheaper, better cocaine. He brought a business model that had worked in Miami's most competitive market: absolute territorial control through overwhelming violence. In Miami, if you tried to sell in someone else's area, you didn't get a warning. You got found in pieces. Tony believed D.C. needed that same education. Carlos Arango, 26, was the supplier connection. Born in Barranquilla, Colombia, raised in Miami after his family fled violence in the early 1980s. Carlos had family ties to cocaine suppliers in Florida and direct access to product coming through the Caribbean pipeline. According to federal testimony, Carlos could move 50 kilograms a week through Miami connections. The question was whether D.C.'s market could absorb that volume. Tony believed it could, if they controlled enough territory. The 3 men formed a partnership in early 1988 with clear roles. Carlos handled supply, getting pure cocaine from Miami to D.C., usually driving it himself up a 95 in vehicles with hidden compartments. Tony managed business strategy, identifying which buildings to take, which local dealers to eliminate or absorb, how to structure their distribution network. K-Rod handled enforcement, making sure everyone understood the new rules. But there were more Miami boys than just these three. Court records from the late 1980s and early 1990s identify at least 40 different individuals from South Florida who participated in the D.C. invasion. Some stayed weeks, some stayed years. They were young, most between 19 and 26. They were hungry, and they believed D.C. dealers were soft, unprepared for the kind of war Miami had taught them to fight. They were right, but they didn't anticipate the body count their success would require. By spring 1988, Tony, K-Rod, and Carlos had a vision, and D.C. was about to learn what invasion looked like. The Miami boys didn't work corners. They took over entire apartment buildings, transforming residential complexes into fortified drug distribution centers. The model was simple and devastatingly effective. First, identify a building in southeast or northeast D.C. with the right characteristics: central location, multiple entry points, residents who were poor enough to be intimidated or bought off. Second, move in with overwhelming force. Third, establish 24-hour operations with armed guards, lookouts on every floor, and a customer service system that made buying crack cocaine easier than buying groceries. Hanover Place in Southeast was their first major fortress. According to Metropolitan Police Department reports and testimony in multiple federal cases, Tony's crew moved into the building in March 1988. They didn't ask permission from local dealers who had sold there for years. They simply arrived, knocked on apartment doors, and made offers. Take $10,000 and move out for 90 days, or refuse and face consequences. Most residents took the money. Those who refused faced K-Rod. Cornell Jones, the local dealer who had controlled Hanover Place for 3 years, refused on principle. He had built relationships in that building. He had shooters who would back him. He told Tony's crew to go back to Miami. That was his fatal mistake. What happened to Cornell Jones became the template. K-Rod and 2 other Miami boys grabbed Cornell off the street in April 1988, according to court testimony. They took him to apartment 304, the same apartment where his body would be found 16 months later. They tortured him for information about other local dealers, about police connections, about who might resist. Then they killed him, left his body in a vacant apartment for 3 days, and finally called his family to tell them where to find him. The message was clear. D.C. dealers had a choice: work for the Miami boys at reduced rates, leave the city entirely, or end up like Cornell Jones. The fortress system worked because it solved every problem simultaneously. Apartments provided security, easier to defend than street corners. They provided infrastructure, places to cut and package cocaine, safe houses for workers, storage for weapons and product. They provided. By summer 1989, Tony's organization controlled at least 7 apartment complexes across Southeast D.C., according to federal prosecutors. Each fortress generated approximately $40,000 to $60,000 daily. The cocaine came from Carlos's Miami connection, pure, cheaper than anything D.C. dealers could access. They cut it heavily, packaged it in $50 and $100 crack vials, and moved it through a rotation of workers who rarely stayed longer than a few weeks. If police arrested workers, they knew nothing. If local dealers attacked a fortress, K-Rod made examples. The lifestyle for successful Miami boys was extreme. Tony drove a Mercedes 560 SEL with Florida plates, wore custom jewelry, took trips back to Miami where he was treated like a king returning from conquest. K-Rod preferred respect over flash. He wore simple clothes but carried a reputation that made grown men avoid eye contact. Carlos stayed in the background, driving cocaine shipments, collecting money, sending profits back to Miami suppliers. But the real power wasn't the money. It was the fear. DC dealers who had been in the game for years, who had reputations and shooters and territory, were being pushed out by out-of-towners in their early 20s. Some local dealers tried to fight back. Most ended up dead or in prison. A few, recognizing the inevitable, joined the Miami Boys operations, accepting reduced positions, but staying alive. The growing attention came from multiple directions. Metropolitan Police Department homicide detectives noticed the pattern. Brutality beyond typical drug violence. Victims who had been tortured. Messages left with bodies. By late 1989, MPD had created a task force specifically targeting the Miami Boys. The DEA joined the investigation after Carlos's name appeared in wiretaps from a Miami cocaine case. Federal prosecutors saw an opportunity to use RICO statutes against an organization that clearly met the definition of continuing criminal enterprise. By December 1989, according to DEA estimates, Miami crews controlled approximately 40% of Southeast DC's crack cocaine trade and were expanding into Northeast. DC's murder rate had increased by 63% since 1987. And Tony Lewis, Kenneth Rodriguez, and Carlos Arango had made themselves very rich and very untouchable. But every empire has vulnerabilities, and theirs were about to be exposed. The first crack appeared not from law enforcement, but from within. In February 1990, according to court testimony, K-Rod shot and killed 17-year-old Marcus Webb in a Southeast apartment. Marcus was a low-level worker who had been skimming, taking extra vials, selling on the side, pocketing a few $100s. In Miami's rules, this was a death sentence offense. K-Rod carried it out, but Marcus Webb wasn't some anonymous street dealer. His mother, Patricia Webb, was a community organizer who had been fighting crack houses in Southeast for 5 years. She knew politicians. She knew journalists. And when she found out her son had been killed by out-of-town dealers who had invaded her neighborhood, she went public with a fury that shocked everyone. "These aren't even DC boys," Patricia told a packed community meeting in March 1990, according to Washington Post coverage. "They came from Florida, they killed our children, they took over our buildings, and our police can't stop them. Or won't stop them." The political pressure became intense. Mayor Marion Barry, himself struggling with drug-related scandals, ordered MPD to make the Miami Boys their top priority. The U.S. Attorney's Office accelerated their investigation. And something else happened, something the Miami Boys hadn't anticipated. Local DC dealers, who had been fighting each other for years, started forming alliances against the outsiders. The second crack was operational. In April 1990, DEA agents intercepted a shipment Carlos was personally driving from Miami, 15 kilograms of cocaine hidden in a modified gas tank. Carlos, facing mandatory minimum federal time, made a decision that would destroy the entire organization. He cooperated. According to court records, Carlos gave DEA detailed information about the supply chain, about Tony's operations, about K-Rod's violence, about every Miami boy who had participated in the DC invasion. But the unraveling really accelerated with the violence. In May 1990, a local D.C. crew led by 28-year-old James J. Rock Harrison decided to take back Hanover Place. J. Rock had grown up in Southeast, had been selling there since he was 16, and watched outsiders take over his territory. He assembled 15 shooters, according to MPD reports, and planned a coordinated assault on the building. The battle happened on May 23rd. 1990. It lasted approximately 40 minutes. When it ended, 3 Miami boys were dead, 2 D.C. dealers were dead, and 5 residents, including a 12-year-old girl, were wounded by stray bullets. The violence shocked a city already numb to drug murders. This wasn't business. This was war. K-Rod's response was immediate and catastrophic. According to testimony in United States versus Rodriguez, D.C. 1992, K-Rod and 4 other Miami boys tracked J-Rock to his grandmother's house in Congress Heights. They kicked in the door at 2 a.m. on May 27th, looking for J-Rock. He wasn't there. His grandmother, 64-year-old Dorothy Harrison, was. She died of a heart attack during the home invasion. The shooting made national news. The pressure mounted from every direction. Federal prosecutors, armed with Carlos's cooperation, began building RICO cases. MPD's Miami Boys Task Force had surveillance on every known member. Community activists were organizing protests outside apartment fortresses, and local dealers, emboldened by J-Rock's assault, started hitting Miami Boys' operations across the city. Tony Lewis recognized the mathematics. The war was costing more than the profit justified. Federal heat was too intense. Community outrage made political protection impossible. In June 1990, according to DEA testimony, Tony started planning an exit strategy, moving money to offshore accounts, establishing legitimate businesses in Miami, preparing to leave D.C. entirely. But K-Rod had a different calculation. He believed showing weakness would invite more attacks. He wanted to escalate, to make such horrifying examples that D.C. dealers would surrender permanently. The partnership that had conquered D.C. was now splitting on strategy at the worst possible moment. The critical mistake came in July 1990. K-Rod, without consulting Tony, ordered the murder of a witness who was cooperating with federal prosecutors. The witness, 22-year-old Devin Mills, had been arrested on minor charges and agreed to testify about Miami Boys' operations. K-Rod had him killed in broad daylight outside D.C. Superior Court. Federal agents literally watched it happen. That murder changed everything. It made the case a federal priority at the highest levels. The FBI joined the investigation. U.S. Marshals started hunting every Miami boy in D.C., and K-Rod's violence had done exactly what Tony feared. It made compromise impossible and guaranteed that law enforcement would never stop. By August 1990, the Miami Boys' empire in D.C. was collapsing. Not from law enforcement alone, but from internal conflict, community resistance, local dealer rebellion, and the exact brutality that had built their power. The question was who would survive the fall. The takedowns came in waves between August and December 1990. Federal agents executed coordinated raids across Washington, D.C. and South Florida, arresting 47 individuals connected to Miami Boys' operations. They seized cocaine, weapons, cash, cars, and detailed records Tony had kept. Records that documented every murder, every building takeover, every shipment from Miami. Kenneth K-Rod Rodriguez was arrested on August 14, 1990, at a southeast apartment. He fought arrest, requiring 6 officers to subdue him. In his possession, 3 firearms, $50,000 cash, and a list of D.C. dealers marked for elimination. Federal prosecutors charged him with continuing criminal enterprise, 14 murders, including the killing of Dorothy Harrison, cocaine distribution conspiracy, and interstate racketeering. The trial lasted 6 weeks. Testimony from Carlos Arango and multiple other cooperating witnesses detailed K-Rod's role as the organization's primary enforcer. In February 1992, Kenneth Rodriguez was convicted on all counts and sentenced to life in federal prison without possibility of parole. He is currently serving his sentence at USP Pollock in Louisiana. Yet in a 2019 interview with a prison journalist, K-Rod stated, "I did what the game required. D.C. wasn't ready for Miami rules. That's not my fault. Antonio "Tony" Lewis fled to Miami in July 1990 before the main arrests. Federal marshals tracked him for 4 months before locating him in Fort Lauderdale in December 1990. Tony's lawyers negotiated a cooperation agreement, testimony against other Miami boys in exchange for reduced sentence. In March 1993, Antonio Lewis pleaded guilty to cocaine distribution conspiracy and money laundering. He received 28 years in federal prison. He was released in 2018 after serving 25 years. According to his own social media posts and interviews, Tony now works in construction in Miami and speaks at schools about the consequences of drug trade involvement. "I helped turn D.C. into a war zone," he said in a 2020 interview with a Miami journalist. "I was 24 years old and thought I was building an empire. I was just stacking bodies." Carlos Arango received the most lenient sentence for his cooperation. After providing DEA with detailed information about Colombian supply networks, Miami distribution operations, and the entire D.C. invasion operation, Carlos was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison. He served 6 years and was released in 1998. His current whereabouts are unknown, though federal authorities believe he returned to Colombia. His cooperation led to 14 additional arrests of Miami-based suppliers who had enabled the D.C. operation. The collateral damage extended far beyond the main players. Of the 47 individuals arrested in the initial raids, 38 were convicted. Combined sentences exceeded 400 years in federal prison. An additional 23 Miami boys fled to Florida and were never prosecuted. The cases were simply too expensive to pursue for mid-level workers. At least 11 local D.C. dealers were killed during the Miami boys' occupation of the city. 5 residents, including Dorothy Harrison and the 12-year-old girl wounded in the Hanover Place battle, died in violence directly related to the invasion. The community impact was profound and lasting. The apartment complexes the Miami boys had controlled as fortresses became symbols of violence that took years to rehabilitate. Hanover Place was eventually demolished in 1997. Residents who had taken payoffs to leave their homes struggled to return. Many found the neighborhood fundamentally changed. Too dangerous. Too traumatized. Patricia Webb, Marcus's mother, became a nationally recognized advocate for communities devastated by crack cocaine. She testified before Congress in 1992 about how outside dealers had weaponized poverty against her neighborhood. The bigger picture reveals how the Miami boys changed not just D.C., but law enforcement strategy nationwide. The D.C. invasion demonstrated that drug trafficking organizations could operate interstate with military-style logistics, that traditional local policing was insufficient, and that federal RICO statutes needed aggressive application. It accelerated the development of multi-jurisdictional task forces, improved information sharing between DEA and local departments, and established legal precedents for prosecuting interstate drug conspiracies. What filled the power vacuum was predictable and tragic. The territory the Miami boys controlled fragmented among local D.C. dealers, many of whom adopted the fortress model and Caribbean-style violence tactics. D.C.'s murder rate, which had skyrocketed during the invasion, stayed elevated through the early 1990s. The violence the Miami boys introduced didn't leave when they were arrested. It became normalized, part of how business was done. Younger dealers who had watched the invasion learned that brutality worked, that fear was more effective than negotiation, that apartment fortresses were more profitable than street corners. By 1993, according to FBI statistics, Washington, D.C. had the highest per capita murder rate in America, a title it would hold for 3 consecutive years. Not all of that violence traced directly to the Miami boys, but their impact was undeniable. They had fundamentally transformed how drugs moved through the nation's capital. The Miami Boys invasion wasn't just about cocaine or money or violence. It revealed something deeper about America in the late 1980s. How economic desperation created vacuums that ruthless outsiders could exploit. How interstate highways and improved logistics made drug trafficking a truly national enterprise. And how communities already devastated by crack cocaine became battlegrounds for organizations that saw neighborhoods as nothing more than market share. The mathematics that drew Tony Lewis to D.C., higher prices, weaker competition, accessible territory, weren't unique to Washington. Similar invasions happened in Atlanta, Charlotte, Richmond, and other cities along the I-95 corridor. Miami dealers, trained in the most competitive and violent drug market in America, exported their model to softer markets and extracted billions of dollars while leaving unprecedented body counts. The war on drugs, as implemented in the late 1980s, had failed to anticipate this evolution. Law enforcement focused on local dealers, while national networks operated with increasing sophistication. The mandatory minimum sentences that put low-level workers away for decades did nothing to prevent organizations like the Miami Boys from recruiting replacements. The Fortress model demonstrated that drug trafficking had become a logistics and real estate business as much as a street corner operation. But the human cost transcends policy analysis. Cornell Jones was 23 years old when he was tortured and killed for refusing to surrender his territory. Marcus Webb was 17 when K-Rod shot him for skimming a few $100s. Dorothy Harrison was a grandmother who died of a heart attack when armed strangers kicked in her door. The 12-year-old girl wounded in the Hanover Place battle survived, but carries bullets fragments in her spine that cannot be safely removed. These weren't statistics. They were people. Sons and daughters, mothers and grandmothers, neighbors and friends. The Miami Boys saw them as obstacles or assets or collateral damage. But they were human beings whose lives mattered, whose deaths rippled through communities, whose absence left permanent wounds that no amount of federal prosecution could heal.